Hi everyone, and welcome to RightShip's Carbon Accounting webinar. Before we begin, I'll just give you a brief overview of how to participate in today's session. First of all, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please press the Help button, which is a box with a question mark on the bottom right of your screen. This will provide any assistance for common issues that some people encounter. We also sent you a troubleshooting guide with your webinar reminder email, which might provide some assistance. We really welcome your questions during today's event, and you can submit these by typing them into the question window, which you should find on the left of your screen, and hitting the Submit button. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that follows the main presentation today, but please, as always, feel free to send in your questions at any time, and they'll be added to the queue. If at any time you have any difficulties with the audio or with advancing the slides, try hitting the F5 button to refresh the presentation. Please also be aware that today's session will be recorded and will be available on the RightShip YouTube channel shortly, and we'll notify you via email when a recording is available. So thanks everyone for joining us. My name's Hannah Gibney and I'm a Marketing and Communications Coordinator at RightShip. Presenting today we've got Kris Fumberger, Sustainability Manager, and Lucy Packham, who's a Sustainability Officer. So thanks guys, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks Hannah.
Thanks Hannah. Now I'll be, after Kris and Lucy run through the main content for the webinar, I'll be helping out with the Q&A, so make sure you keep sending your questions through. But first of all, I'll hand over to Kris to give a bit of background about RightShip. If you'd like to take it away, Kris.
Will do. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so RightShip, if you've listened to our other earlier webinars, you'll have a good understanding, but those who haven't, I'll give you a brief introduction. So back in 2001, RightShip came about to basically improve maritime safety. So there was several incidents and accidents happening around the world, particularly some off the Western Australian coast here in Australia. So BHP and Rio Tinto joined forces at that time to basically improve the maritime safety of the industry. So 18 years later, we've made great leaps and bounds in terms of maritime safety, and roughly about 7 or 8 years ago, we had a lot of interest from customers about the environmental sustainability of the world's fleet, and that's where we started looking into that space. And most of you will be aware with RightShip's GHG rating and the use through the vetting process and so forth, selecting more efficient vessels. And this is a growing area that we're seeing at the moment. We've got 62 charterers moving about 20% of the world's freight using this as a selection process. And that's a nice tie into today, how we talk about carbon accounting and this webinar about supply chain sustainability, and we'll go into a lot more detail there. But in terms of RightShip, we're a global organisation, 24 hours a day, with head office here in Melbourne in Australia. We've also got Houston and London offices as well, where we have operational staff there as well. Okay, so now I'll pass over to Lucy to run us through the agenda for today's webinar.
Thanks, Kris. All right, so obviously we are doing a webinar on carbon accounting, so we might start with some industry context. So what's happening in the industry at the moment that's causing companies to account for their shipping emissions. We'll go onto a bit of an overview of carbon accounting, so what that actually is and what we're measuring there. We'll go through some results of analysis, just for a bit of perspective, some key benefits to those involved, run through some case studies, and then some next steps for those who are wishing to get involved and how they can start accounting their emissions.
Thanks, Lucy. Now I'll talk about what's happening in the maritime industry and why people are wanting to move in this space and make change. So as we all know, there's pressure around the world for the industry and also the world to decarbonise. Paris Agreement's been spoken about a lot. Shipping was left out. However, shipping moved on and decided to basically come up with its own greenhouse gas strategy about how it's going to reduce its emissions by 2050 by 50%. So this is exciting from a maritime industry perspective, but there's regulation and so forth associated with that, and the IMO recently met and decided on some more measures, particularly around container ships, to bring that forward. However, what we're seeing and hearing from industry, from the market, is that they want to move faster than regulation. So it's not moving fast enough for them. They want to transition to that low carbon economy soon, and there's various reasons for this. Not only the companies and sustainability experts want to move in this space, but also too there's external drivers like shareholder pressure and boards and so forth that are telling management that they need to move and understand their emissions as we're moving along. So this is all about that industry leadership, and we're seeing this basically at unprecedented rates now. So we're getting charterers and cargo owners coming to us and saying, how do I understand my emissions? What are they related to in the shipping space, and how do I manage those and move forward and get ahead of regulation? And I think that's the key piece, is that the market is really saying they want to move ahead and really push forward, and regulations trailing that. And this all sort of comes together in the fact that they can see the benefits for them in that risk management piece and being able to actually understand what their supply chain looks like, something that's been hard to do in the past in the shipping space, but we're providing that context, and mainly our chartering customers are looking to manage that risk now, but also into the future in terms of their supply chain. So now I'll just hand over to Lucy to run us through the ins and outs of the carbon accounting tool.
Thanks, Kris. So what are Scope 3 emissions? Most companies have a pretty good understanding of their direct emissions, so those Scope 1 and 2 emissions from sources owned or controlled by the company, and things like electricity to power their operations. But what's not historically as well understood is the Scope 3 emissions, and that's sort of where we fit in. So those emissions that can be attributed to shipping activity have historically been quite difficult to measure and understand, and that's where we, RightShip, come in to offer some expertise in the area and help increase some understanding. So while Scope 3 emissions aren't well understood by many companies, they can be incredibly large contributors to their total emissions. We've seen up to 90% in some cases of a company's total emissions. So that's why we've developed this tool to help make measuring and managing those emissions a bit easier. So we might pass over back to Kris so he can go into the details of what it is that we are measuring.
Thanks, Lucy. So I think you hit the nail on the head there with that standard approach using our tool. So it's all about, we've validated using a European standard, EN 16258, and this gives us a consistent and verified approach. We've also had a third-party auditor review our process, which gives it that robustness as well. So what are we actually measuring? Well, we're measuring the amount of fuel that's used in the overall voyage. So whether you're doing 30 voyages, 300 or 3,000 voyages, we can give you that standardised approach. So what we do is we add up the well-to-vessel tank emissions. So this is basically the refining process and getting that fuel to the vessel. Then we add in what actual fuel is used on the vessel. So this roughly makes up about 90% of the fuel use, and in the maritime industry this would most likely at the moment be heavy fuel oil. So by adding the refining plus the actual vessel emissions, we then come up with an overall amount. So we've got overall well to propeller emissions, and this gives us that CO2 equivalent, which covers off a journey from, say, port A to port B, and then we can use this standard approach to look at that over however many journeys are within your supply chain. So now if we look at what an example voyage looks like, this is one of our, I suppose, popular choices at the moment with a lot of our customers, is taking iron ore from Port Hedland in Western Australia up to China to some of their customers, or it might be Japan, but this voyage is up to China. So we can see here that the vessel's name is Pacific Treasure. Its GHG rating is D, which shows it's an average vessel, so it's average in its size and type. This is roughly 180,000 tonne, 1,000 tonne deadweight bulk carrier. It was about 98% full when it left. It used the heavy fuel oil, which we mentioned before, and its EVDI was 2.35. So all of these factors get used into calculating what the actual life cycle emissions or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions are. So we can see here that with the emissions for this full cargo going from Australia to China, there was just over 2,000 tonnes of CO2 used for this journey. So that gives you an indication of what an example journey looks like. Now we'll hand over to actually go into, when you start to add up some of these supply chain emissions, what the actual results look like and what the analysis coming out the end of the process looks like. For this, I'll hand over to Lucy.
Thank you. So here's an example sort of results summary page we provided for one of our customers, one of our tanker customers. So basically we were looking at their voyages over a 12-month period in 2018. So the total company emissions were 65,177 tonnes of carbon equivalent emissions. So that can be broken down into voyages. So they made 176 voyages over the year, and each voyage on average was around 370 tonnes of CO2. They had a pretty even spread between chemical tankers and crude and product tankers. So here's an example of the kind of insight that we can offer. So we've broken down the cargo quantities into different types, and so you can see that this customer, for example, has moved almost 50% of their cargo has been diesel, and around a third was same. So we can allocate emissions to those cargo types. So in this instance, 50% of the cargo that they moved was diesel, but that might have been just a short journey. And so having an understanding into the distances that they're travelling, the types of vessels that they're moving their cargo on, we can sort of break this down further into emissions attributed to the different cargoes, which is something that we've found that customers have been really interested in the past. Also, we can look into load and discharge ports and emissions for a company working through a certain area. For example, one company wanted us to look into their emissions moving through the Houston Channel, which is good for them to be able to then manage those emissions, and it's a good community engagement piece, and they're able to then decide to charter more efficient vessels in that area. And yeah, it's just an example of how we can break down the accounting into different fields.
Okay, so now we'll have a look at the benefits within the supply chain of understanding your emissions and looking to quantify them. So mentioned right off the top of the bat that the market and our charterers are really looking to show leadership in this space. They really want to move forward past regulation and really tackle this head on and really understand their emissions within their supply chain. So it's all about measuring to manage. So once, like Lucy mentioned earlier, that up to 90% of some customers' emissions are within their Scope 3 supply chain, so their shipping component, for example. So customers, once they get an understanding of what their emissions look like within their supply chain, they've got that measurement, and then they can actually look to manage those moving forward. So this is that leadership piece, is I understand my emissions, I'm looking to manage them, and there's various techniques and opportunities to do that. One is RightShip's GHG rating, and then we'll talk about soon some other options. But I think overall what we're hearing from customers and what we're trying to put in front of them is that opportunity to manage that risk. So if you've got 90% of your total emissions in your company being sort of in that Scope 3 bracket, there is a risk there, and you can get ahead of the curve and actually look to manage those. So what we're seeing in this reporting space is customers are really liking that standardised approach offered by the European standard EN 16258. This gives them a consistent approach that they can rely on. It's robust and it's been externally verified. Some customers, and we'll touch on one later on, we have several customers, but we'll touch on one specifically. But they're using their annual reporting, so their sustainability reporting, also alignment with different reporting structures like CDP and so forth. So these benefits are really starting to shine through now, and customers are really enjoying that certainty around the carbon accounting tool and being able to manage these emissions and actually look to reduce them and manage their risks. So that's pretty heavy on the theory and what the process is and how the tool works and some of the results and so forth. I think now we'll jump into some actual case studies and show you in the real world how our customers are using the results and what some of the benefits are in terms of different case studies. So in terms of the case studies, I'll give you a real example of one of our customers using in their sustainability reporting. So for the last few years, we've been quantifying Scope 3 emissions which are associated with their shipping component in terms of using BHP here. This is an extract from one of their sustainability reports, and basically it's just demonstrating how they use our process to account for their carbon in the for the Scope 3 shipping, and this equates to close to 3 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. So it's a large amount of shipments, it's a large amount of cargo, and we've had really good feedback in terms of breaking this down per cargo type and so forth. So when they're moving products like iron ore and coal and nickel and so forth, we can break it down by those cargoes, and also the load and disport. So for example, they move a lot of goods from Northwest Australia, we can break it down into those from the load ports as well.
So once companies have an understanding of their emissions, the next step is to manage them. So companies can use our GHG rating, which is a vessel efficiency rating tool. So where vessels are compared against other vessels and rated in terms of how efficient they are. So this is on an A to G scale, and they can use that rating in their chartering process to select the more efficient vessels, which then translates into emissions reduction. So for an example, this study was undertaken by the Tyndall Research Centre in Manchester in the UK. So basically they looked into an example voyage for Cargill, which is one of our customers. So it was a bulk carrier vessel that was that sort of did a round the world voyage, and they decided to select a C-rated vessel, so a more efficient vessel than an F-rated vessel, and it translated to about 919 tonnes of CO2 savings, which worked out to be close to 11% of emission savings.
So Lucy just ran us through a great example of how different customers, and we've got 62 charterers at the moment who are using F&G rules or rules to improve the sustainability of their supply chain. And we're seeing big changes in the supply chain, but at the end of the day, ships are still burning fuel and creating emissions. So there's other opportunities out there to obviously measure and manage those emissions, and this example on the screen is a really good example of that market leadership that we've spoken about several times during this webinar. So what Insightec Pivot did, they're a fertiliser company based here in Australia, and they've been working with us we've been working with them for a number of years. They move different fertilisers around the world and to their customers around Australia. They have a couple of hundred shipments a year, roughly about 73,000 tonnes of CO2 per year out of their shipping process. So it's a substantial amount of carbon emissions. So what they did was they basically worked with us for a number of years to understand these emissions. They've had an F&G rule which basically excludes the most inefficient ships out of their supply chain. This has been working really well. They've also been optimising their supply chains to basically try and source products from the best areas in terms of shipping routes and so forth. But at the end of the day, they do have emissions, and what they wanted to do was show the market that there's There's opportunities to reduce those emissions through management techniques like F&G rating and so forth, but that can only go so far at the moment in terms of better vessel selection. So the next step in the process, and we worked with them for a fair while to get this over the line and get the right option in front of them, but they basically looked at their supply chain over 2 years, so the 2016-17 and the 2017-18 financial years, and said we've got close to 150,000 tonnes of CO2 associated with our shipping for those 2 years, and they said what we want to do is offset those buying carbon credits. So in terms of market leadership, it really sets them above and beyond all of their competitors, and is a great example for the industry out there that there's options to look at your carbon reduction techniques and then also offset the remainder of your emissions. That was a really good example of a charterer showing market leadership. This next case study is one where there was multiple partners involved, and I think it's really good to show that the maritime industry is now moving forward just past individuals showing leadership. It's about partnerships as well. So what this was is basically Anglo American showed a lot of leadership in the carbon offsetting piece here. They wanted to move an iron ore shipment from South Africa up to Europe on a baby cape. What we actually saw was the ship owner coming to the table as well, and basically working with Anglo American, with RightShip, and the carbon offset provider who's South Pole, who's based in Europe. And we all came together and said, this is a 68-day journey, 5,880 tonnes of carbon dioxide will be emitted during this journey, including the ballast and actual laden voyage. And what the ship owner wanted to do was basically set themselves apart from their competitor and say, how about I work with you to offset these emissions associated with this shipment for Anglo American. Obviously RightShip were very keen to facilitate this. Anglo American is very keen to reduce their emissions within their supply chain, and South Pole provided the 5,880 tonnes of CO2. So just a really good example of not only charterers pushing in this space and showing leadership, but I think the key point out of this is that ship owners are now very keen in understanding emissions, trying to reduce them by operational measures on their ship, and retrofits and upgrades, but also too looking to carbon offset where they can and join up in those partnerships with charterers and RightShip and so forth in the industry to show that market leadership.
You're probably all eagerly listening, wondering how to get involved. Well, you can contact us via email for a trial at environment@rightship.com, and we can discuss carbon accounting in relation to your company. Then you can start positioning your company as leaders in the market, having a better understanding of your supply chain, and then managing your risk. Because while regulation has been moving slow, it is moving, and industry is moving fast.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Kris. Now that concludes the formal presentation for today, and we'll launch into our Q&A sessions. So we have already received a couple of questions, and we thank you for those, and we'll get around to those in a moment. And please, anyone else, if you have questions that you're sitting on, please send them through now, and Lucy and Kris will answer them as best they can. Great. So the first question that has come through, how could we use your carbon accounting tool? Could we do the estimate ourselves, or should we ask you to estimate for us? Kris, do you want to take that one for us?
Sure can. Thanks, Jermaine. Really good question. So at the moment we undertake the assessment as part of the validation and the third-party validation we need to. So yeah, very much a process we undertake for our chartering customers and also ship owners. In the future, we are working on a module to basically have this align with your vetting activity. So I can see you're one of our customers. So say you run X amount of vets per month, you actually get the plan is to have a report at the end of the month of all of your emissions information and all the vetting outcomes. So that's a future state as we grow the customer base, but very much we take it one-on-one at the moment, and down the track we plan to have that online tool like you mentioned.
Great, thanks Chris. One for Lucy. What type of information would we need to provide for you to do an assessment of our ship emissions?
Yeah, so the information that we require in order to complete the calculations is so cargo information, so the quantities of cargo that's being included on each voyage. We need information on load port and discharge port, so just the names, and if it's any stops along the way, so we can account for multi-leg voyages, so where they're sort of stopping off at multiple times, the one vessel is, and dropping different amounts of cargo off. We consider that, and then just the vessel IMO numbers. So then we use the IMOs to link to our database, which has the vessel-specific information, and that's where we come up with the voyage emissions tallies that are vessel-specific. So we're happy for any interested companies to get in touch, and we can talk them through it and organise a trial. So,
great, thanks Lucy. Okay, one for Chris, I think. How reliable is your data taken from the vessel for operational purposes, in brackets vessel to propeller? Do you rely on the noon report, or are there other data sources?
Yeah, it's a great question. So basically, some charterers that have the information provide us with the actual fuel use. So from their charter party agreements, that's usually noon report, and that is obviously the best information. When this isn't available, and that's quite often, then that's when we use the RightShip database and our vessel-specific information.
Great, thanks Chris. Okay, another question. You mentioned bulkers and tankers in your example. What about other ship types? Lucy, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So while our work historically has been largely in the bulk and tanker space, we also have many customers that move cargo via containers and ro-ros. So while those calculations can be slightly more complex, they're definitely within our capability and within our methodology, and it's something that we do see come up all the time. So most of our customers will have a variety of different ship types that we can incorporate into the calculation, so that's not a problem at all.
Great. Thanks, Lucy. Yep, okay. Another question. We save money in fuel by using a vessel with a better GHG rating, but does having a better rated vessel mean that it's more expensive to rent? Kris?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, because we get this a lot from ship owners trying to improve their ratings, and also charterers using ratings for different purposes. So the GHG rating on the A to G scale, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of charterers are excluding F and G rated ships, for example, or some are excluding E rated ships, so the bottom third of the market out of their supply chain. Your question is around you're saving dollars in fuel. Yes, I very much agree, and we've done studies with Tyndall Centre and so forth, which Lucy mentioned earlier about savings in CO2 and fuel. In terms of how we do you save money? Yes, and then in terms of do you pay more for that rent? Well, that's very charter specific, and anecdotally, I think yes. Vessels with better GHG rating or risk rating also generally get better rates, but I think the key point there is they're in a better position within the market, and they should get more work more often. The vessels with, say, F and G rated, I'd be pretty confident that they'd be getting less work from the charterers using our rating, and probably finding it harder to secure pieces of work in the market. And to be honest, a lot of the time they don't actually know that they, say, would get excluded from a vetting outcome because they may not be notified, but this happens, many times per day.
Great, thanks, Kris. Question, can you use actual fuel consumption if we have it from our ship? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I can. So we welcome the submission of fuel use data if it's available. that's quite easy to calculate emissions from that, but often our clients find that this information is quite hard to obtain, and so that's where we use our methodology to determine the theoretical emissions. However, yeah, as I said, if it's available, happy to accept that and calculate the emissions that way.
Yep.
That's okay. Sorry, just having some internal tasks here. Okay, so I've got a question. Any plans regarding the use of EU MRV or IMO DCS reporting? Kris, do you want to answer that one?
Thanks. That's so good question from Christian. So at the moment, EU MRV very much European centric. So obviously not all shipments go through EU and not all are reported through there. Also the IMO data collection system, that's something that's just coming in and data's just starting to come about. At the moment, we're not involved in either program. However, in the future, I think definitely the IMO data collection, if we can incorporate that data and make it easier for our chartering customers, then we're keen to look at that. I think that'll make the process even more robust. So that's probably a future state at the moment.
Great. Thanks, Kris. Another one for you, I think. You mentioned investors earlier. What's the main motivators for charterers to be involved?
Yeah, so that's a really good question too. I think we're seeing more and more, probably actually 5 or 10 years ago, we had Scope 3 emissions or the ship emissions were sort of in effect someone else's problem. That's we pay for the cargo to go on board, and that's someone else's problem. What we're seeing now with investor pressure and things like TCFD and so forth, which is a task force for climate disclosure, we're seeing that pressure now come back upon the charter or the big, whether it's a mining company or whether it's someone's moving different goods. We're seeing that pressure come down from above, so the investors are starting to put pressure on the companies. Also, the board have that responsibility from the TCFD. So they're starting to ask questions and want to understand what their supply chain looks like. So people that follow shipping closely, it's supply chain. It's like the Modern Slavery Act as well. It's now your responsibility. You can't just palm off that responsibility, and that's a similar type approach that we're seeing in terms of charterers saying, well, these are our goods being shipped. Even if we put it on someone else's ship, there's still that responsibility there. So they're wanting to understand what their emissions are, and this is growing more and more. And I think we're seeing some ship owners at the moment who are quite smart and getting ahead of the market, and they're working with us to position themselves well in front of charterers. And for example, we recently had the Anglo-American example we had where the ship owner actually said, right, let's set an example and offset these emissions for this cargo. And it's amazing since then the amount of ship owners that have been in touch asking more and more questions in this space. How can we get involved? We want to partner up. We want to look not only with RightShip but also the charterers to make sure we're in a really good market position.
Great. Thanks, Kris. I think this is a good one to finish on, and I might send it to Lucy. So if we want to estimate GHG emissions on a specific journey with a specific vessel, should we send a request to your environmental mailbox?
Yes, you absolutely should. That's definitely within our capability. So as I went through before, the information that we need to estimate emissions are the journey details, so load port, discharge port, cargo quantities, and vessel IMO, and then the rest is within our system. And that's absolutely fine. So the email address is on the last slide, so environment@rightship.com, and we're happy to take any inquiries that come through.
Great. We've actually had a last-minute question, and we might make this our last. So, Kris, how do we make sure our data is accurate, particularly, especially data that has not been submitted to RightShip formally by operators?
Yeah, this is a very common question from ship owners or operators. So what we do as RightShip, we sort of have I'll call it a hierarchy of data. So we've got obviously in terms of our system, the best data comes from the ship owners, whether that's EDI technical files or shop tests and so forth. We obviously want to utilise as much of that data that we can. And then we go down through the ranks, and there's engine manufacturer information and information we get from shipyards and also sister ships, and so the list goes on in terms of where we source our data from, and IMO circulars and there's many more. In terms of vessels that aren't verified, they're basically assessed on a set of assumptions. So we assume that, say for example, 2 sister ships, if we've got some information from one sister ship, we'll look to apply that across the rest of the sister ships. So there might be 5 ships in that group or 50 ships, and that's a reasonable assumption. So that basically covers off as a good starting point, but we also reach out to the owners and work with them to verify their vessels. And I think there is a piece in there where in our last advanced GHG webinar we spoke about that the onus is basically on the ship operator to work with us and update their information. It's not a requirement, but it basically puts them in a good position when they're looking to obtain a charter party, or if they want to promote their vessels or have them in the best light they can in the market. So we've had many good examples of this, and yeah, in terms of working with you and basically getting that information updated, I think this would be really beneficial. So yeah, we continue to work with the market, and we think we've got a really strong and robust data set in there, but we're always looking to improve it, and yeah, look forward to working with you on that.
Great. Thank you, Kris, and thank you, Lucy. Now, a few of you have sent through questions that we haven't quite gotten to in this Q&A session. So we do apologise if we didn't make it to yours, but Kris, Lucy and the rest of the team will be able to respond to these offline in the coming days. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be sending around a survey, and we really appreciate your feedback. We'll also be sending you a video recording of the session. We encourage you to share this with your colleagues and within your wider networks. Also, Lucy was mentioning before, we've spoken a little bit about our GHG rating. So our YouTube channel has previous webinar sessions on that and other videos if you're interested in learning more on that, as well as our safety and risk, our services in the safety and risk space. So as always, if you have any questions or any inquiries to do with carbon accounting, please contact environment@rightship.com. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thanks, Kris, and thanks, Lucy, and hope you all have a good day.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Hannah.